Doctors stopped her heart, switched off her brain, cooled her body to 20 degrees. For almost an hour, not a single brainwave appeared on the monitor. By every parameter medicine possesses, during that time there was no consciousness, no thoughts, no her. And yet she later described exactly what the surgeon said, what instrument he was working with, what song was playing in the background in the operating room, things she physically could not have heard, because her ears were blocked by headphones emitting 100 clicks per second, and her eyes were sealed shut with tape. This is not a story from a book. This is one of the most thoroughly medically documented cases in the history of death research, and nobody to this day has been able to fully explain it. Her name was Pamela Reynolds. She was 35 years old when doctors found something in her brain called a giant aneurysm, an enormous balloon of blood in a vessel right at the base of the brainstem. The aneurysm was so large and so deeply positioned that no surgeon under normal conditions would dare to touch it. One careless movement of the scalpel and the patient dies on the table. But if nothing is done, the aneurysm would rupture on its own within weeks, perhaps days. There was only one doctor in the United States who had the courage and technique to try. His name was Robert Spetzler, and his method was so extreme it sounded more like science fiction than medicine. The method was called hyperthermic circulatory arrest. The plan was this: cool Pamela's body to 20 degrees Celsius, literally switch the electrical activity of her brain down to zero, stop her heart, drain all the blood from her body through a machine, and for a short window of time, literally leave her in a state that medically is indistinguishable from death. A flat line on the brain monitor, no pulse, no breathing, no blood in the body. Only in this window, when there is no risk of bleeding, can the surgeon safely reach the aneurysm and remove it. After which, she has to be brought back, step by step, reversing the entire process, before the damage becomes irreversible. To make sure Pamela's brain was genuinely switched off, doctors connected headphones to her ears that continuously emitted loud clicks 100 times per second. These clicks had one purpose: to stimulate the brainstem and check whether it was still responding to sound. If a response appeared on the monitor, it meant the brain was still partially active. If nothing appeared, it meant they had achieved complete neurological silence. Pamela's eyes were sealed with tape. Her head was fixed in a metal frame, literally screwed to her skull with bolts, so it would not move even a millimeter. At this point, by every definition that exists in science, Pamela Reynolds had no physical possibility of seeing, hearing, or experiencing anything. The cerebral cortex was flat. The brain stem was not responding. Blood was not circulating in her body. The operation began, and then when she woke up, she started describing things that left the entire medical team in shock. She said that at a certain point, she felt as if something had pulled her out of her own body. Not fear. More like jumping out of something tight into fresh air. From this position, as she later described it, she was floating above her own body and saw herself from above, lying on the operating table. She saw her shaved head prepared for surgery. She saw the doctors working on her. And she described something she had no right to see, the instrument the surgeon was using at her skull. She said it resembled an electric dental drill, only slightly different, with attachments stored in a special container that reminded her of a set of interchangeable drill bits her father kept in his garage. When she was later interviewed in detail, Dr. Spetzler and his team were in shock. She had described the instrument that was actually used, a device called the Midas Rex bone saw, with a precision that was staggering. Despite having never seen such equipment before, despite the fact that during the operation her eyes were sealed shut, despite the fact that by every medical parameter she was unconscious, but this was only the beginning. Pamela went on to say that she heard a conversation, specific words, a specific voice. She said she heard a woman's voice say that the vessels on one side were too small. This referred to the vessels in the groin through which she was to be connected to the cardiopulmonary bypass machine. When the surgical records were later checked, it turned out that this is exactly what had happened in reality. The cardiac surgeon, a woman, had indeed said something very close to this during the procedure when she was trying to establish vascular access on the side that turned out to be problematic. Pamela also stated that a specific song was playing in the background in the operating room, one she recognized and later quoted. The medical staff confirmed that on that day a radio was indeed playing in the operating room, and the music matched what she described. At this point, it is necessary to stop and understand why this is so deeply uncomfortable for science. This is not a case of someone having a dream under anesthesia and confusing fragments of conversations heard in a semi-conscious state. Pamela had sealed eyes and ears filled with loud, continuous clicking, stimulating the brainstem, placed there precisely to rule out any possibility of hearing anything from the surrounding environment. Her brain, in the electrical sense, was empty. Zero activity. There is no existing scientific model that explains how a person with no brain activity and no physical possibility of hearing sound can later accurately quote specific words spoken by a specific person at a specific moment during surgery, words that were subsequently confirmed in the medical documentation. Pamela described her experience as not ending with the observation of her own operation. At a certain moment, she felt something beginning to draw her in. Not a dark, frightening tunnel, the way it is sometimes depicted in films. More like a vortex of energy, piercingly bright, in which shapes could be made out almost like sound, that had transformed into light. She felt herself being pulled deeper and further, away from her body, from the operating room, from everything she knew. Having passed through this vortex, she found herself in a place filled with light, where she began to recognize familiar figures. The first person she recognized was her deceased uncle. She described feeling his presence before she saw him, as if she recognized him through something beyond sight, before the mind had time to process it. Her uncle guided her forward, like a guide who knew exactly where to take her. Then she saw her grandmother. Her grandmother, who had died when Pamela was still young, now looked different from how she appeared in her memories. Younger, full of energy, radiating something Pamela could only describe as pure joy. Communication worked differently from usual, not with words in the ordinary sense. Thoughts transferred directly, without the need to speak, without delay, without the misunderstandings that normally accompany conversation between people. She felt herself moving further and further from the awareness of her physical body, from pain, from the limitations she had carried her entire life. She described it as a feeling of dissolving, as if the boundaries that usually separate one person from another were beginning to fade. She felt herself part of something larger, as if the entire universe was one enormous connected network, and she, in that moment, was simultaneously herself and something considerably larger than herself. But that feeling of peace did not last long. At a certain moment, she felt something beginning to pull her back. She didn't want to return. She said afterward that it was like being torn from the most peaceful sleep she had ever had, back to something heavy, painful, and unwanted. She felt her consciousness beginning to contract again down to the boundaries of one body, one point in space, one pain. The next thing she remembered was a feeling as if something was pressing her back into her physical body, almost like diving back into a pool after a long breath at the surface. The operation ended successfully. The aneurysm was removed. Pamela survived a procedure that theoretically had very slim odds of success and returned to normal life. But what she brought back with her from the operating room was something more than a scar. When doctors and scientists later analyzed her case, they tried to find a rational explanation. Some suggested that perhaps at certain moments during the operation, her brain was not as completely switched off as the instrument readings implied. Others pointed out that she might have heard fragments of sounds before full anesthesia was applied, and her mind later assembled these fragments into a coherent narrative. But these explanations have one serious problem. They do not answer the question of how a person with sealed eyes and ears, filled with loud continuous clicking, could accurately quote specific words spoken by a specific person at a specific moment during surgery, words that were subsequently confirmed in the medical documentation. The case of Pamela Reynolds became one of the most frequently cited in near-death experience research, precisely because it is so rarely this precisely documented medically. In most NDE stories, There is no way to verify whether the patient's brain was truly inactive at the moment they were experiencing visions. Here, there are printouts from monitors, surgical documentation, witnesses, the timing of the operation documented to the minute. And there is a woman who described things which, according to those very documents, she should not have been capable of knowing. What does this mean? Some scientists argue that this is evidence that consciousness is not simply a product of brain activity, that it can exist independently of it, at least under certain extreme conditions. Others argue that we simply do not yet understand well enough what happens in the brain in borderline states, and that one day a fully neurological explanation will be found. Both sides agree on one thing. The case of Pamela Reynolds has not been fully explained, not by those who believe in it, and not by those who are trying to refute it. Pamela herself spoke about this experience calmly until the end of her life, without any need to convince anyone. She didn't try to build a career on it, didn't write motivational books, didn't preach revelations. She simply described what she had experienced, exactly as she remembered it, and allowed others to draw their own conclusions. Perhaps that is precisely why her story has lasted this long, and is still being analyzed today, decades later, by scientists, doctors, and anyone who has ever asked themselves, what exactly happens in that brief window when the heart stops beating and the brain falls silent? Because if consciousness can genuinely exist for even a moment outside the body, even when every medical indicator says there should be nobody there, then the question that remains is larger than any neurosurgical procedure. What else do we not know about the boundary between life and what lies beyond it? Write in the comments. What about Pamela Reynolds' story strikes you most? The instrument she described with sealed eyes, the doctor's words that matched the surgical record, or the simple fact that a person with no brain activity at all brought back memories that cannot be explained?